Right, okay, so in this exercise I'm going to recreate this game here. So it's a pretty simple 3-lane game, so where the player, the gray spaceship, can jump between 3 different lanes like this, and it's avoiding other spaceships, and if he gets hit, then it will turn red and the game is over. So it's just a very basic prototype, but it should give you something to work with. So what we have here is we can take a look at our object. So we have our player, we have our enemies, so they're spawning from a spawn point which is located here. We just have our lanes, and that's pretty much it. So the game itself is very simple. Additionally, I do have a little menu, so let me just go here. So I just created something like this. So again, I just assembled it with the game assets that I had. And the way this works is we have our little game, and if I press start, I will jump into the game and I'll start playing like that. Okay, so first of all, I will start from nothing basically. I will just delete everything like this, save it, go to my game, delete everything here, or in fact delete the scene itself like this. Go to my menu. So okay, so menu is the only scene that I have right now, and I will delete all of my assets like that. Okay, so I'm basically starting from scratch, like other than I have already changed my background to dark purple. So you can work with this color if you want to. It's 130011. I suggest just working with any dark color because my assets are quite bright, but this purple color works quite nicely with this. So first of all, I will import my assets, so they are here. I'll just drag and drop them into my project like this, and I'm not going to use this anymore. Right, so let's quickly create a little menu. So I just want to add 3 lanes like this. So lane number 1. So I always prefer centering objects at the beginning like this, so maybe I could make it a little bit wider, so scale to like that, and then make it kind of like big enough so it just disappears behind the screen. Then I will just copy this and I will place it here. Another one is going to be here. So these are my background objects, just lanes, and they are located on ordinary layer of 0. So let me just see what happens if I add a player. So here's a player. So right now he appears on top, but if he appeared behind this object, then you could always bring it up by changing its layer to 1 or anything higher than 0. So this is my player. I would want to again center it like that. Give it rotation, so minus 180 on z-axis like that, and then I'll place it here as well, so 0, minus 3, 0. Then I could place my enemies here, so this could be my enemy number 1, and again, if it appears behind the lane, you could always bring it up by changing its ordering layer like that. And then I will just make a few of them, so I'll press Ctrl D, move one here, move one here like that, so it just kind of like a little setup. I will add my title screen, so like the name of my game, and you can keep it like that. I think it's quite interesting if the enemies can like appear on top of the the title screen, but I will bring it forward to like, let's say 5, so it's above everything, and maybe also give it a little bit of rotation so it just looks more fun. I'll just center it, so it's centered, and now let me just move it up in the world axis like this. Okay, and let's add a start button. Again, I want to bring it up 5. Center that 0, 0, 0, and move it somewhere here. In that case, my enemy could maybe go a little bit higher. Okay, so this is kind of like a basic menu. you know, you can see what the game is about. It's like a little space shooter, and if I hit, you know, start, I should start the game. So let me just save that. You know, I'm happy with my menu. So now I would want to add a script to the start button. So basically whenever I press the start button, I will go to the game. But for now we only have one scene, so let me just add additional scenes. So create scene. I will call this one game. I will go to the game, and so you can see just default background. Let's keep it at that for now, so we can see when I will load the game scene, the background will change and there will be no objects there. So now, so in my menu, I would want to add, so in here, I would want to add a little script. So whenever I press a start button, I will go to the game scene. Okay, so let's create a script. Call it go to game. Double click. Okay, so so here's our class. So I'm not going to use any of the regular functions, so I don't need start or update function. I'm just going to use on mouse down. Okay, and so this is basically whenever I will click on that object, something will happen. So for now we can just print start. Okay, so we'll save that. So you can see I have created my own function, on mouse down, right? There are also other options that you can check out in your own time. We have on drag, on enter, on exit, over. There's a lot of interesting options that you can play with. But for this tutorial I'm just using on mouse down, which is basically when I click on the game object. So save this, go to your game, and now here's a very important step. So if I pressed play now and I clicked on this game object, nothing is going to happen. This is because if you want your object to work with these functions on mouse down and, you know, mouse up and so on, if you want it to work with these options, then you would want to take your game object and give it the box collider. So box collider 2D, like that. So basically now I will be able to click on that. So you can see that you know, box colliders in Unity are not only used for physics but also for other interactions such as mouse interaction. So let me just press play. So Unity should compile this. It's taking a little bit longer than usual, but okay. So here's my game, and I will press start. Let me just pull out my console. Here we go, and I'll press start. And nothing happened. This is because I did not add my script to the start. So let me just do that. Okay. Okay, let's try again. So open my console, start. So you can see start button is responding. And I will want to go to a different scene. So to go to a different scene, I will need to load up using Unity engine dot scene management. So I'm loading up this library to have access to different scenes, to basically to be able to load different scenes. So instead of start, I will just go to scene manager dot load scene, and I will load it by name. So there are several options. You can, you know, load it by number, so, you know, depending on this number in the order, which I'll show you in a second. But I find it easiest to just load them by name, because if you know what the scene is called, then you can just load it based on that. So let me just go back to Unity. So you can see here are my two scenes. We have menu and we have game. If I go to file, project settings, so they are already here because I have already made this game before. But if you want to add your scene, and you have to make sure it's added, because if it's not added, then it's not going to load. But you can see now the game scene is added in my scene build, and it will be accessible through the scene library here. Okay, so let me just press play and see if that works. Okay, so start. Okay, I can see I'm in the game scene. So I change the scene just by pressing a button. Okay, so let me go to the game scene, but I think before I do that I just want to copy my color. So this is also a thing you can do. You can just copy a color that you like from your inspector, go to different object, so for example here, and just paste your color. Okay, and so now let's just set up basic just the basic like 3 lanes in here, so like basic layout of the game basically. So I always start by positioning my objects in the middle, 0, 0, 0. Then I will make this a little bit thicker, and let's just make it wider, so 10 is enough. So that's 1, maybe a little bit wider, 12. So this is my first lane. Then I'll duplicate it and I'll move it here, second lane, third lane. Okay, so my lanes are done. I can rename them, 2 lanes. So the next thing, I want to add my player object, which will be able to jump between different lanes. So here's my player object. I will bring it a little bit forward, so it's above my background, and also will position it in the center, move it down a bit so it's located at 0, -3, 0. That's a good position. So right now it's upside down, so I just want to rotate it. So you can either do it, you know, like this, so it's facing upwards, or you can just change the position rotation here directly like that. Okay, so here's my player. So now I will want to add so I want it to be interactive with other game objects, well, with enemies. So I just want to add a box collider 2D. So I kind of wanted to move kind of like old school games, so just like basic movement and no physical interaction. So I'm just gonna change this to a trigger. So basically objects can pass through each other. I can detect the collision, but I can't, there will be no physical response. So I'll make it into a trigger. So then so after that I would want to add a rigid body 2D. So same thing is here. It's like I don't want to deal with any of the physics. I just want it to be interactive, so I can change it to kinematic like this, and you can see all the physics options, properties, they have disappeared. So just changing it to kinematic like that. And yeah, this is pretty much ready to go. Close that. So now we'll just add the player controller script. So player controller. And here's my player. Oops. So I was trying to type when it's compiling. So player. Here we go. I will add the player control script here. So, and we just wanted we just want to be able to move it between 3 different lanes, right? And we kind of already know our positions. So our first position is 0, -3, 0. Our second position is -4, -3, 0. And fourth position 4, -3, 0. So we know between, like, we know the positions of lanes. So this is good. We can make these positions into vectors that we can use later on for moving our player. So let's create vector 3. Left position is a new vector 3. -4, -3, 0. Then we will create a mid position, which is a new vector as well. And so our middle is our current position, which is 0, -3, 0. And then we have our right position, new vector 3, which is, so in this case it's 4, positive, -3, and 0. So these positions are good to go. So just to test if it works, I can just type in transform.position is equals to mid position. Okay, so basically when the game starts, my player will move to the middle position, and this is a good practice because I can, you know, whenever I'm loading my game, or you know, let's say like I was adding other game objects and maybe I moved my player by accident, it's good to have like initial player position in the same place like where it should be. So let's say, you know, I was messing with my backgrounds or other sprites and my player just moved here by accident and somehow didn't notice that. So if I press play, it will jump to the beginning, so this is great. But for now, let me just move it back. Okay. So our player is here, so the next thing to do is I want to have some sort of input. I want to have control over my player. So for that I'm going to use my update function, and I'm going to use these positions. So here's our update function. Let me zoom in, and so we will have left input and we will have right input. Okay, so on left input, so there are basically two possible options. If I am here and I'm pressing left, I can go to the middle, and if I'm here and I'm pressing left, I will go to the left lane. And same in reverse for the right input. If I'm located here and I press right, I will go to the middle, and if I press right again, I will go here, and nothing else can happen. Okay, so let's just write this logic. So I will just use arrow keys. So if input dot get key down, so if I'm pressing a key down, key code dot left arrow, so if I'm pressing left arrow like this, then so if transform dot position is set to mid position, then transform dot position is equal to left position. So this is first part. So, now we need to add next part. So else if, so basically otherwise, if transform position is equals to right position, then I want my game object to go to the middle position, mid pose, like that. So this is working. This is good to go. Now I will basically need to write the same thing but for right input, so I can just copy that, place it here. I think I need to add another bracket. Let me just check. Yeah, so when you're not sure, you know, how many brackets you have, just always check with the lines. Well, as long as you're keeping your brackets on the lines, it's easy to follow if you like open and you close a bracket. But yeah, so this is going to be my right arrow key, and we gotta do a similar thing here. If transform position is equals to mid position, then transform dot position will become right position, so we'll go to right side. Okay, else if transform position is equals to left position, so if I'm on the left side, then I'll go to the middle, and transform the position is mid pose, like that. So you can keep it like this. I think this is fine. This code is quite straightforward, but I think that you can do is if you know that you have only so you have your if statement and you have only one expression followed afterwards, you don't actually need to use all these brackets. You only need to use these brackets if you have, you know, multiple expressions here, but here I only have one. So what I can do technically is move this like that and get rid of all of my brackets, and so this could make your code easier to read. So you can keep it on a single line like this, or if you want to, you can drop it down. I prefer dropping it down. But yeah, this is quite straightforward. Like if this happens, then do this, and otherwise if that happens, then do this. And it's, I think, shorter to read than this. But also this is, you know, entirely your preference. If you prefer this way of writing, you know, stick with that. I'm just showing you different options. But I think for me, I will just change to this. So like that, here we go. Let's just clean up our code a little bit. Just get rid of all the spaces. So these comments, they make sense. And I think our logic is correct. So let me save that. So let's quickly press play and test what's going on here. Okay, so left, right. So you can see I can move between 3 lanes, like that. And if I'm, you know, on the left lane, I can't go left, and if I'm on the right lane, I can't go right. I'm just here. So this is definitely working. Okay, so now let's, I think it's time to add an enemy. So I will start by dragging and dropping the sprite in like that, making sure it's on top of the lane, so just give it a higher order in layering like this. And I will also make sure it's above the player, because, you know, the behavior of the enemy will be very simple. It will appear behind the screen, move in, and if it collides with the player, it will turn it red, and then once it passes the screen, it can destroy itself, right? So let's just place it somewhere here, so it's basically on the collision course. So for my enemy, I will want to add a box collider 2D and change that to a trigger, right? So now my enemy here, let's call it enemy like that, enemy and player, so they're both triggers, so they can interact with each other in a similar way. And another thing is, so our player has a collider as well as a rigid body, but our enemy doesn't necessarily need a rigid body, because you know, if player already has it, then I can collide with it. So this will not be true. So for example, if I had 2 enemies, they cannot collide with each other because neither of them have a rigid body, but both of them can collide with the player because player has rigid body. So just be careful, like where you're placing your rigid bodies, and you know, if your object doesn't have a rigid body, you can't collide with it. Okay, so this is a good start. So they're all triggers. So here's my enemy. Let's add a little script. So this time I will add it from here. I will just type in enemy as a component, create a new script, and you can see we'll add it here and to my project. Okay, so I want to have a very simple behavior here. I want to move my object down, and I want to destroy my object. So either if it passes, you know, below the screen, or if it exists for 5 or 10 seconds. So let's just do the movement first. I'm going to use a fixed update for this, because I want my simulations to be the same every time. And I'll just do transform.translate, and I'll do 0. My speed will be, let's say, minus 0.1 f, and on z it's 0, like this. So this should move our object downwards. Let's just try that. Okay, so yeah, our enemy is moving down. It's touching player, but it just keeps on moving, and we just now want to delete it. So I will keep it very simple. I will just use the destroy function. So on start, so when the game starts, you can destroy your game object, right? So this is one of the options, because so you can call this function on any frame, and on that frame the object will be destroyed. So just to show you how it works, like if I were to run it on start function, my enemy will just disappear straight away. So look, press start, boom, it's gone. It just appeared and disappeared. But instead of this, I want it to disappear after, let's say, 5 seconds, which is, you know, enough time for it to pass by and go outside of the screen. So this time here is in seconds, so this is 5. Save that. And it's also a good idea to convert this into a variable that we can change later. So float speed is equals to 0.1f, and an interesting thing you can do here, you can just take that speed, you can place it here, and you can simply leave the minus in front of it. That way, when I change speed, it's easy for me to think, you know, of the speed, and I don't need to think in negative values. So yeah, so let's just test that. So I'll press play. Okay, it passed by, and when 5 seconds pass, yeah, it disappeared. This is great. So our enemy is pretty much ready. It has collision, it has a simple behavior, it is ready to go. So I will convert it into a prefab, and when I convert it into prefab, it will appear in my project here. And now you can also see it changed its color to blue. So this means I can simply delete this object, and I can always bring it back. I can always bring up multiple versions of it like this. But obviously I don't want to bring it back like this. I want to bring it with a script that will spawn these objects dynamically, right? So let's create a spawner. So typically I do it by creating an empty game object. So an empty game object just has a transform, and I'll call this a spawner. So another thing, so you can see our object is here, but if I unclick it, it kind of like disappears into the scene. So if you have an object that doesn't have any visuals, it's a good idea to give it a little label. I will go with green here, so it's visible, so I'm aware that I have this game object in my scene, and this label here, it will never appear in my game scene. Well, unless I choose to. I think there's an option here to enable it somewhere. Yeah, you just click on that. But typically you don't want to see that, so I just disable it. So here's my spawner. So first I will need to add a spawn script. So let's add the spawner script, or generate enemies. I'll just call it spawner so it corresponds. So again, it added it to the object, to my spawner object here, and the project, right? So, you know, this could always be removed and re-added like that. It's the same, like same exact step. So now I'll open my spawner, and I just want to have a reference to my enemy object. So let's create a public game object enemy, and this is, you know, reference to our prefab. So right now it will appear here, but you know, our object is not assigned yet, so make sure you select your prefab from the project and just drag and drop it here. So not your sprite, but your prefab that you have created with, you know, behavior and all the things that you have made. Not the sprite, okay. Okay, so now we have access to our prefab. We can try to instantiate it. So an easy way of doing it, we have a script for that. Instantiate enemy, and so what this function has, it has a so extension is a transform.position. So basically we will instantiate our object at certain position, and it will also ask for rotation, and I'll just give it default rotation, which is like in script it's written as a quaternion identity. But so just for the demonstration's sake, let's just see if this function is working. I'm just spawning an enemy on each frame on update, and I'm spawning it at spawn position point, right? It's not ideal, it's not what we want, but we just need to, you know, prove the concept. So I'll just press play, and you can see it's almost like I made a brush with enemies, but yeah, it's definitely generating enemies, and they are definitely disappearing, so that's good news. So now instead of this, I will want to generate my enemies. Let me check. Just move it here. So I think I'll want to generate them like here. So 0, 6, 0. Here, -4, 6, and 4, 6. Okay, so that looks like a good spot. Okay, so same again. Let's just create those variables, those vectors for positions. So vector 3, position 1 is new position. Sorry, new vector, which is 4, 6, 0. Vector 3 is position 2, which is going to be 0, 6, 0. Yep. And vector 3 position, so this will be negative, right? So -4, 6, 0, like that. Okay, so we have our 3 positions. You know, we can always test that by taking one of the positions and placing it here, and this will be our position. So position 1 is 4, so it's 4, 6, 0, so you should spawn it there. Yeah, and it's spawning them there. So even though if I move my spawner now, it's just spawning them there, which is the effect I want. But of course, instead of spawning it there all the time, I would want to have some sort of random number generator that generates 3 values, let's say 0, 1, and 2, and then based on those values, it's going to spawn enemy at this position, or this position. So I will want to use an integer, so random number. So this will be our RNG basically, and I'm keeping it as integer because I don't want to use a float, because float will give me values like, you know, 0.2, 0.7, and you know, I don't want to use that. I want to use integer values like 1, 2, 3, 4, like full numbers, right? So let's say now random number will be so I'll be changing it on each frame. So random dot range between 0 and 3. So these should give me values 0, 1, and 2. Yeah. And then I can say here if random number is equals to 0, then I'll just move that back here. Then instantiate enemy at position 1. Then I could copy and paste that. If it's position, if I get random number with value 1, then enemy will appear at the second position, and one more time. If random number is equals to 2, then it will appear at my third position here. So again, let's just save that and test it, see what happens here. I should be spawning my enemies on lanes, but of course it will be spawning too often. So here we go. I'm just absolutely flooded by enemies, but the good news, they're spawning, and they are despawning, and yeah, so we can see that this is working. So the next step from here is to add some sort of a timer how often the enemies spawn. So before I do that, I'm going to make that into a function to make my code a little bit cleaner. So let me just show you. So I'll just add a void spawn enemies. So I just created my own function. I just called it that. So when you're creating your own function, make sure you're not using like existing name such as update or start. Make sure it's your own original name. And I'm just going to take all of this here and move it here, right? So now all of this is located in this function, and I will just call my function on update like this. So basically I have encapsulated my code So I'm just calling this function, and it executes all of this code, and it just looks cleaner because on update I can see that I'm running this function. So if I went back to Unity, you know, the effect will be exactly the same, but the difference is my code is cleaner now. Okay, so this is working, so let's add a timer. So to add a little timer function, let's add a float timer, and this will be timer in seconds. And so if you simply just add time.delta time, this will be your time in seconds, since, you know, this object started running, right? And then we just want to say if timer is greater than, let's say, 1 second, then we will want to spawn our enemies. And important step, don't forget to reset your timer to 0, because otherwise, you know, you will keep on spawning enemies after 1 second. But we want to reach 1 second, you know, this happens, I spawn my enemy, just single enemy for a frame, and then I will reset my timer to 0, so I can do it every second. So this should be good. Let's try that. So now enemies should be appearing every second. Yeah, and that's about right. So it's a good idea to make this time interval into a variable. So I'll just call it spawn interval, and I will give it value 0.8f, so just a little bit less than 1 second. So I'll copy that here, paste it here, and you should be ready to go. Okay, so this game is a little bit more challenging now, but you can see, you know, even though the challenge here is not ideal, I'm generating my enemies dynamically, and every time the pattern is different. So they're coming in just a little bit above the screen, and they are also disappearing here. Right. So one more thing. So when the enemies collide with the player, so nothing really happens. So let's just take care of that. So I'll go back to my enemy script, and here I will use on trigger enter to D. Right. So remember, we've set player to a trigger and enemies also to a trigger. So this is why we're using on trigger enter. So this is when the collision happens. So remember, there are 3 functions: on collision, on trigger enter, on trigger stay. So this is while you are colliding with the other object, and there's also on trigger exit. So this is when you left the object, right? So on enter and on exit, so this happens only once, right? So when you actually collide with the object, and this function here is continuous. So I don't need to use them. So for this example here, I just need to use on trigger enter. And if you don't know what this is, so these are just an array, a list of game objects that are using collisions. So in this case, right now we're just a player, but as the game starts, you know, the enemies are popping in. So all of these objects are potential objects from that array, right? So we can even go ahead and print collision, so the object I'm colliding with, and we can print its name like that. Let me just open console. I'll press play. Okay, so I'll just let it collide, and you can see I have collided with player, and each one of the objects, whenever they collide with the player, they know it happened, right? So instead of colliding with the player, I just want to know if its tag is a player, right? Because you can have multiple game objects in your scene, but instead of calling them by name, it's probably easiest to just give them a tag. So I'm going to give it a tag player, and I'm going to change my sprite to red. So if collision.tag is player, then so collision, which is player, dot get component, so I'm just accessing a sprite render dot color is color dot red. Okay, so if that object that enemy is colliding with, if that object is player, then I will change that object's sprite to red. And in a similar fashion we can access that object's script and other components. But let's just test that. So I'm gonna start with changing it to untagged, so nothing should happen. So you can see if this will collide with me, nothing happens. But if this was a player, then these objects will detect it. The enemies will detect the player. So here we go, it turned red. Okay, so this should be like a nice little example of how to create a dynamic game, at least basics. You also learn how to switch between scenes. So we start here, we switch to another scene, and we have a little triple lane game which is fully dynamic. So I press play, start. So here's our some sort of a challenge going on. So this is the game design part. You will have to work on that a little bit harder. This is just a simple example. You can have different types of enemies coming in at different, based on the timer and so on. And of course, there has to be some sort of feedback. If I hit the enemy, the game, do I lose lives? Does the game reset? Do I go back to menu? Like, what happens? So these are just things to think about, but this should be a nice little prototype for you to work with. Right, so thank you for watching.